Hello everybody and welcome. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the defensive shape team instruction in Football Manager. And let's get started with an overview. When making your tactic, you can tell your team where to line up defensively, controlling where they're positioned on the field and when they engage the opponent. And that'll be the focus of today's video, the defensive shape team instruction. We're going to look at a match to see how the team instruction plays out, but let's first go over the basics. There are two adjustments we can make, the line of engagement and our defensive line. Let's start with the line of engagement. This option generally applies to the more forward players in your formation, in which you have three options, a high press, a mid block, and a low block. Each setting has its own benefits and drawbacks. A high press will tell your players to engage the opponent further up the field, but the description tells us how they do it. The first player will trigger the press, and then the supporting players look to block the passing lanes. So, a high press gives the opponent less time on the ball, but at the risk of losing your defensive shape. A low block, as the game tells us, instructs your players to sit at the halfway line, and look to focus on blocking passing lanes rather than an aggressive press. The low block gives your opponent more time on the ball, but you will retain your defensive shape and make it more difficult to pass through. A mid block is the balance of the two. It's not quite as aggressive as a high press, but it's not as passive as a low block, and your players engage just ahead of the halfway line. To create your team defensive shape, the line of engagement you set works together with the defensive line you set. There are 5 options you can choose: much higher, higher, standard, lower, and much lower. The higher defensive lines will compress the space your defenders allow in the midfield, moving closer to their upfield teammates, which in turn makes your team more compact higher up the field. However, you are giving space in behind your backline, and this makes your team susceptible to long balls over the top and runners in behind. The lower and much lower defensive lines will compress the space in front of your goal, restricting movements in dangerous areas, and will protect against your opponent's speedy attacking players. The trade-off is that you generally allow the opponent more time to get started in the midfield, since your defenders are positioned further towards your own goal. However, there's a crucial element to the defensive line setting no matter which one you choose. Thankfully, the game tells us this important bit of information. The defensive line instructs defenders how high they should position themselves, and here's the important part, when the opponent has the ball in their own half. The defensive line is an out-of-possession team instruction for when the opponent has the ball in their own half. Naturally, when the opponent brings the ball closer to your goal, your entire team will retreat backwards to try and win the ball back. And now that we have an idea on how the defensive shape instructions work, let's check it out in a match. I set up a dummy save with Crystal Palace, and our very first match of the season is against Brentford. I used a simple 4-4-2 since that's a good shape to see how our formation works. There are no team instructions, and then we'll see how our defensive shape can change when I add them in. Our first clip comes in the 4th minute, with Brentford on the ball attacking to the left. Since the ball is in their half, our defensive line is basically halfway, which makes sense because we're on a standard defensive line. The ball is going to go to the other center back, and watch my defenders hold that standard line. And we'll see our mid block in action too. These are my 2 strikers. They'll close down the ball a bit, but when it goes backwards, they retreat into the mid block position, not being overly aggressive. This next clip is a few minutes later. It's the same instructions, but we're going to focus on my strikers. We start the play with us on the ball, and then the opponent gets it to the goalie. Your player roles also contribute to your defensive shape. This striker is an advanced forward, an attacking role positioned high up the field. This is a deep-lying forward, a supporting striker role. As the opponent works the ball down the sideline and into the penalty box, here's the deep-lying forward, and this is the advanced forward. Also note how deep our defensive line is because the ball is no longer in the opponent's half, it's in our half. As the opponent advances the ball into your own half, it doesn't matter what the initial setting is. In the 24th minute, I changed to a low block but kept the standard defensive line. This instruction mainly affects our more forward players, so we're going to focus on them. Funny enough, we had scored a goal, so this clip is from the kickoff. As Brentford start to pass, my two strikers are now sitting on the halfway line, instead of above it. It may be subtle, but they're not as aggressive in closing down either. They're following the ball, but they're not upsetting the foundation of our defensive shape. In our last low block clip, we're going to see how the setting focuses on blocking passing lanes and restricting space rather than overtly closing down the ball. We start it with us on the ball about to clear it long. As Brentford established their possession, watch my player here. He's blocking the passing lane and making sure the opponent can't recycle possession. Our last clip of the first half will be with a high press with a standard defensive line. With the high press, let's focus on my three forward players, who are going to follow the ball and look to harass Brentford as they pass it around. This is a more frantic way for your front players to defend. We've looked at a few clips of the different line of engagements, but I want to show two screen grabs to really illustrate our defensive shape. So here, the opponent has the ball outside the center circle. This is our defensive shape in a low block. Compact, together, and no clear gaps. However, we're not pressing the ball, so we're not really giving ourselves a chance to win it back. This means the opponent has more time to make the right decision, even if we're making it more difficult. In this one, we're playing with a high press. Our winger is tucked in, losing width on that side, and our strikers are out of position, giving up space in the midfield. However, we're also pressuring the ball, giving them less time to make the right decision and giving us a greater chance to win the ball back. Now that we know how line of engagement works, let's head to the second half and talk about defensive line. I set our defensive shape to a mid-block and then the much lower defensive line. We start our clip with us on the ball, now attacking to the left in the second half. We're going to lose possession and watch the backline all retreat towards our own goal, giving up space in the midfield but not allowing a run in behind. When they have the ball outside the center circle, our backline is outside our penalty box. Let's go back to a clip in the first half to show the difference between the standard defensive line and a much lower defensive line. So again, this is the first half and Brentford have the ball. Let's watch my back four. They work it into the midfield, and with a standard defensive line, my players all hold their position. This restricts space in the midfield, but could leave us at risk for a runner in behind. Now let's go back to the second half clip. This is with the much lower defensive line. They pass it into the midfield, and all my defenders drop back towards our own goal. And they don't really push back up either. They stay in that deeper position. As we continue, in the 70th minute, we'll look at an example of a much higher defensive line. Brentford has a goal kick, and when their players get the ball, my two center backs are in the center circle. We are constricting the midfield, but obviously conceding space in behind. Again, the defensive line is an instruction for the opponent with the ball in their own half. If we compare the defensive lines, on the left is the much higher defensive line, and on the right is the much lower defensive line. The last clip we're going to look at is a simple one: what a low block and much higher defensive line looks like. We were attacking, but now the ball is in the opponent's half. My defenders are going to hold that much higher line, but the rest of the team will fall back into a structured defensive shape. We only looked at a few variations, but hopefully those examples show you how the defensive shape team instruction works. Of course, there's much more to your defensive shape than just changing a team instruction. Your formation affects how you defend. Your player roles affect how you defend. Your players' attributes affect how they defend. There's a big difference between a pressing forward and a poacher when it comes to defending, or a player with a high work rate versus one with a low work rate. As we wrap up, if you're curious about any player roles or tactical styles, I've got different playlists here on the channel that you can go through. I've also got a Patreon account if you would like to support the channel. Anyway, that's all for today's video. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you for watching.